I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 14 of my series on the JFK Assassination. In the 1964 presidential race between the incumbent, Lyndon Johnson, and the GOP presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, the assassination of President Kennedy did not become a campaign issue. That's primarily because the official commission that Johnson had brought into existence, the Warren Commission, named after the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, had just recently published its final investigative report, known as the Warren Report, issued in the latter part of September of '68, just before the November elections. The report concluded that President Kennedy had been shot by a lone assassin that was firing shots from the president's rear. They concluded that no shots were fired from the president's front. And immediately after the report was issued, most everyone accepted it. It accepted its legitimacy. The mainstream press especially went gaga over the thing, talking about the multiple volumes and all of the testimony they had taken and their investigation that they had undertaken, and especially over the credentials of the members of the Warren Commission, who were just your standard members of the Washington establishment, members of Congress, the Chief Justice, even the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, who interestingly enough had been fired by the deceased president after the Bay of Pigs disaster. But after the election, people started raising questions. And as people started reading the report and they started reading accounts and criticisms of the report, everybody started to have a sense of unease, to the point that most Americans 2 years later just didn't buy the official version at all. It all just looked too pat. Lone nut assassin, communist kills president, mafia-like figure kills assassin, investigation immediately shut down. Everything shrouded in secrecy, in fact, ordered to be kept secret for 75 years. And Americans are exhorted to move on, get along, go on with your lives. People said this is just really bizarre, really strange. They just didn't buy. They sensed that something was wrong here. And sure enough, people started challenging it and raising questions in a more formal way. As we've discussed in a previous episode, there was a lawyer named Mark Lane who wrote a book called Rush to Judgment that became a New York Times bestseller. He also produced a movie that you can see online by that name, where he interviewed witnesses that were not interviewed by the Warren Commission. Harold Weisberg, another person, ordinary citizen, raising questions in books. Another book by a guy named Richard Epstein called Inquest. So things were percolating, so that by the time mid-November comes along, it's pretty clear that things have shifted in the country. Now, why is November important? Well, in early November, that's midterm elections. And why is that important? Well, because as soon as those elections are over, the attention of the country starts moving toward the upcoming presidential race in 1968. People speculating on who's going to be running, who's going to be the GOP nominee, people putting feelers out, talking about going to Iowa, going to New Hampshire. The nation's attention is now focused on the presidential race. And clearly Johnson, at this point in mid-1966, mid-November 66, he is clearly running for re-election. Johnson loved being president. He was loved the adoration, he loved the glorification, he loved the power. And all his life he had wanted to become president. It was like an obsession for him. In fact, after he lost the presidential nomination in 1960 to John Kennedy, he was despondent because he thought he was never going to become president. Somebody asked him, why he was giving up the position of Senate Majority Leader, which was an extremely powerful position, to take the vice presidential slot, which had no power at all. Johnson's remark was kind of interesting. He said that a certain percentage of presidents die in office and that he intended to roll the dice and take his chances. Well, by the time November 66 comes around, Johnson has to know that this time around, when he's running for re-election, the assassination is going to be a campaign issue, in large part because of all of these things that are being raised, these books that are being published and so forth. And then in January 67, the press learns that the district attorney of New Orleans, Jim Garrison, is bringing a criminal investigation that is reinvestigating the Kennedy assassination. And Garrison would later allege that this was a national security state regime change operation and cover-up. So at this point, it's almost a foregone conclusion that the assassination is going to be a major campaign issue. I think this explains those 3 meetings at the National Archives. The one in November, just after the midterm elections, then the one about a little more than a month later in January of 67, and then the Clark panel report in late February of 1968, about a year later. Now, did the Justice Department know about the shenanigans in the autopsy? Well, my hunch is no. The military had been very successful in encasing this autopsy in secrecy concrete, with secrecy oath, letters of secrecy, threats to the soldiers that they could never talk or they're going to get prosecuted or court-martialed if they ever disclosed what they had seen. The whole operation was shrouded in classified information, and everybody knows what that means. And it had worked. I mean, 3 years after the assassination, there was virtually no leaks about the autopsy. All the things that we've covered in this series, most of them would not come out till the 1990s with the ARRB and the JFK Records Act. Some of it started to come out in the mid-70s with the House Select Committee when it started releasing soldiers from their vows of secrecy. But in 66, the seal is working. And so my hunch is that it's just difficult to imagine the military coming over to the Justice Department and saying, hey, look, we conducted a fraudulent autopsy. We got bogus photographs and x-rays. We got all kinds of shenanigans. We snuck the body in early. Can you help us cover this up? It boggles the mind that would have happened, especially since the Justice Department is in the business ordinarily of prosecuting crimes. I think there's a much more likely explanation for why these 3 meetings, and that explanation lies with Lyndon Johnson, because he has the power to orchestrate these meetings. All he has to do is tell the Justice Department, this is what I need from you, and the Justice Department is going to follow through, and he doesn't have to explain anything. And why would Johnson have done this? Well, remember, he's up to the top of his head in this fraudulent autopsy because he's the guy that launches the autopsy scheme in the first place. Remember that altercation at Parkland Hospital. As soon as President Kennedy is declared dead, that team of Secret Service agents goes right into action. They get the Dallas casket, the heavy, ornate, expensive casket. They put the body in there. They tell Dr. Earl Rose, the medical examiner, under no circumstances are they going to permit him to conduct the autopsy. And he tells them, this is Texas law. This is a homicide case. I have to do this autopsy. Well, you're not going to be permitted to, they told him. And he stands his ground for a while, but they pull their coats back and brandish their guns, and making it very clear that they're prepared to do whatever's necessary to get this body out of there. It's an extraordinary event in the history of U.S. criminal justice. I mean, you hear about obstruction of justice today. This is classic obstruction of justice because this is Texas state law. Now, it's important to keep something in mind here. The Secret Service had no jurisdiction here. The FBI had no jurisdiction. The Justice Department had no jurisdiction. And certainly the military had no jurisdiction. It was not a federal crime to assassinate the president. This was a straight state murder case, which is why Texas law required this autopsy in cases of homicide. They're obstructing that process. And the team leader says that he's operating under orders. Now, there's only one person who could reasonably have issued that order, and that's Lyndon Johnson, because they go into action immediately on the death of the president, which means they had to have received that order, and how important it was for them to get that body out of there at all costs before the president dies. And that had to be the vice president. There's no one else who would have conceived of such a thing, to order the Secret Service to do that. And to corroborate this, we have circumstantial evidence. We have Johnson headed directly to the airport as soon as President Kennedy is declared dead and starts removing seats from Air Force One. Now, why would he do that? Well, because he knows that the body is about to be brought there, because presumably he's the guy that issued the order. And then when he gets to Andrews Air Force Base, he doesn't summon the local medical examiner. He is bound and determined to get this body into the hands of the military. Now, is it possible that Johnson would do all this without knowing what the military was about to do? Well, possibly, but not very conceivable. There's no way that a vice president and a new president is going to involve himself in this kind of scheme without knowing all the details and all the reasons why. And certainly, by the time 66 comes along, Johnson is fully aware of what's happening at these shenanigans. And I think that that's what he's doing with these 3 meetings. He's getting his ducks in a row in case the issue arises during the campaign. Now, to corroborate this, there is a recorded telephone conversation that was kept classified for many, many years, but finally got discovered. And it's a telephone call where Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General who Johnson had appointed, close confidant, fellow Texan of Lyndon Johnson, telephones Johnson immediately after the second meeting at the National Archives. This is the meeting in January of 67, the day after he telephones Johnson to give him an update on the 2 meetings. So Johnson clearly has a keen interest in these meetings. And he tells Johnson that, well, there's been possibly a discrepancy with maybe one photograph, but everybody's on board. They've signed the affirmation. They've said that this is a true and correct inventory. Johnson says, great. He shows no interest in any discrepancies, that as long as people are signed up, he's in good shape. And he even writes a memo to himself about what had been said in this telephone conversation. And so my hunch is that what Johnson is thinking, he's a masterful politician. He's planning strategy. And he's now got the pathologist, the radiologist, the official photographer committed, saying that this is a true and correct inventory of the photographs and x-rays. That way in the campaign they can't pop up and impugn the authenticity of this thing, or they'd be admitting that they committed perjury. He's got the autopsy pathologists recertifying their work and saying that they're consistent with these photographs that they had to know was bogus. And then he's got the Clark panel. Now remember that Boswell, Commander Boswell, testified before the Assassination Records Review Board that it was the Justice Department that asked him to request this Clark panel, this panel of independent pathologists, to review the photographs and x-rays to see if they could put their seal of approval on the original autopsy report. But why would the Justice Department care? If they're doing the Clark panel to defend against these questions that are being asked, why would it matter that somebody found out that they were the ones that called for this Clark panel? But that's why I think it's Johnson that was doing this, because Johnson doesn't want people to know that he is orchestrating this. Because I figured that what his plan is during the campaign, when people raise questions about the autopsy, he's got his aces in the hole. He says, look, I've got this certification that it's an accurate inventory. I've got this certification from the autopsy pathologist that everything is still the same. And then here's the ultimate ace in the hole. I've got the Clark panel report. These are esteemed pathologists, independent pathologists, reputable, prominent, competent pathologists that have reviewed the autopsy photographs and x-rays, and they have put their seal of approval on it. Well, except for the 4-inch move of the wound in the back of President Kennedy's head, which of course he wouldn't have mentioned. But I think that explains why the Clark panel was kept secret. If the Justice Department was using it to buttress the defense of the Warren report, they wouldn't have kept it secret. The secrecy is explained by Johnson's plan to use it, I believe, as part of his campaign strategy. Well, March of 1968, this is like the next month after the Clark panel. So the Clark panel reflects that Johnson is still going to run for re-election as late as February of 1968. The following month, just a few days later, is the is the New Hampshire primary. I believe it was in late March. And here, Eugene McCarthy has entered the race against Johnson for the Democratic Party nomination, and he stuns the nation. He gets 40% of the vote. Johnson got 49%, but which was still pretty impressive, though, because his name wasn't on the ballot. These were all write-in votes for Johnson. But in any event, McCarthy stuns the nation because he's galvanizing the anti-war vote. By this time, things are not going well for Johnson. He's got the Tet Offensive in January of '68. He's got massive anti-war protests, tens of thousands of soldiers dying, massive death and destruction in South Vietnam, North Vietnam because of the bombing. And so things are not going well for Johnson. 2 weeks or so after McCarthy stuns the nation, Bobby Kennedy enters the race. Here's the brother of the deceased president now running against the incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson. Now it is a foregone conclusion that the autopsy or the assassination is going to be a campaign issue. There is virtually no doubt now that Bobby Kennedy, he had always paid lip service to the Warren report, in large part because he didn't have direct evidence to question it, and he didn't want to be called a conspiracy theorist. But he had always made it pretty clear to friends that if he was ever to get to the bottom of this, he would have to be president. And remember, on the day of the assassination, he even called the director of the CIA over to his house and confronted him directly and asked him, had the CIA done this? So in any event, Johnson has to know that this is going to be a campaign issue. About 2 weeks later, Johnson suddenly stuns the nation by dropping out of the race. And people have said, well, it was because he saw the handwriting on the wall that he might lose the race, and that things weren't going well for him, and he was despondent, and he had become a peacenik after all this, waging all this death and destruction. He suddenly decided that he's going to work for peace in Vietnam in the waning days of his presidency. That's a possible explanation. I think there's another more likely explanation, and that explanation revolves around the autopsy of President John F. Kennedy.